Huston Smith, an authority on the world's major religions, has taught at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Washington University, and the University of California. His books include Why Religion Matters and the classic text, The World's Religions. I interviewed him in Berkeley, California. Well, Huston, first of all, thanks for taking the time to talk to me here today.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
Now, in your new book, you have some pretty severe criticisms of, not of the modern world, but of some modern ways of looking at the world and looking at the universe and our place in the universe. Can you kind of tell us what the essence of your critique is?
Well, I think it can be put quite simply. The Chronicle of Higher Education had one significant, put much of the point in one sentence when it said, if anything characterizes modernity, it is the loss of the sense of transcendence. Mm-hmm. And then it goes on to define what it means by transcendence. A reality that encompasses and surpasses our everyday affairs.
Okay.
Now, let's just start with that. That is a tremendous loss. My work has been in the world's great religions. All of them emphasize transcendence.
So the world has lost its sense of there being a transcendent reality.
Another reality, which, by the way, is not elsewhere. It's not like up there. It's more like a wider circle that encompasses us and is right here.
But it's beyond the physical world.
It's not physical, and that's why science cannot pick it up. And because science, due to its tremendous prowess in understanding the physical world, we have made actually a very simple but a fatal mistake in assuming that science is the royal road to truth in all areas, which it is not. It is at the same time the near perfect way of understanding the deep structure of the physical world, but it cannot get its hands on values, meaning, purposes, these things that our lived lives are just made of. And I'll just add one more word. Up until the rise of modern science, everybody believed that we were descended or created from a reality greater than we are. Mm-hmm. I could run through the gamut, but I might not need to do that, but that's been unhorsed by this single fatal mistake.
Yeah, well, in fact, in your other book, and this is the book you're probably best known for, which has sold, I guess, millions of copies around the world, The World's Religions, or The Religions of Man, as it was known back when it was permissible to say that. You summarize something that, in your view, all the world's religions have in common.
Yeah.
First of all, ethically, there are commonalities. Secondly, in the virtues that they see, there are commonalities, things like humility, veracity, charity. And then you define a commonality of vision of all the world's great religions, and you say that they all share three things.
Yes.
What are those?
The three are, they say first that things are more unified than we normally experience them. You know, in our everyday lives, so many things just make no sense. They don't fit together. In fact, there's a little joke: if you want to give your grandchildren a toy that will teach them about life, give them a jigsaw puzzle, no two pieces of which fit together. Now, that will teach them what life is like. And that's the way on the surface it seems. But here, science is coming to the aid of religion metaphorically, because the deeper it delves into the structure of nature, the more the laws lock together. Mm-hmm. I mean, the clear example is space, time, and matter used to be three things. Now there's no way they are interlocked, so each implies and so on the other.
But you believe there's ultimately a unity even greater than any one that science can show us.
Yes, because it includes life and our lived lives, values, meanings, and purposes, and science can't touch those. But there is a hero, Lord, the Lord thy God, the Lord is one, the Shema of the Jews. Hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God, the Lord is one. And they all say that in their various terminology. So that's the first thing. So
all the religions, whether or not they are monotheistic per se, whether or not they're even theistic per se, whether or not they even profess belief in a God, you're saying they see an underlying unity to ultimate reality.
Right.
Now, there are two other things that you mentioned that's common to all the religions in the realm of vision. There's the world is more mysterious than it seems. There's more than meets the eye, and the world is kind of friendlier than it seems. Is that right, or better than it seems?
Better. This is universal. The symbolism of space. The horizontal arm symbolizes space. The vertical arm symbolizes worth, value, meaning, and purpose. Mm-hmm. And here again, metaphorically, science comes to religion's aid in a thumping way, because it says that space, which before the devices of modern science was a very kind of cozy little place, and now 15 billion light years across. I mean, we can't begin to imagine the difference. Now, the startling thing that the religions say in common is that the vertical axis is as much longer, that is, going towards greater and greater worth, value, meaning, until it climaxes in, the scholastics called it, the ens perfectissimum, perfect being. And so that's the third thing that the religions say in unison.
Okay, in one form or another. Now, when you say the universe is better than it seems, reality is better than it seems, suppose you say that to someone who's suffering tremendous pain, and they say, how can you say that? My universe is what I'm feeling right now, and if it feels painful, it by definition is painful. That is my ultimate reality from my point of view. I'm sure you've heard this.
Well, I've not only heard it, I've experienced it. And this leads to what is technically called a kind of pastoral question. I would never breathe a word about the whole scheme of things being perfect to someone who is in the valley of the shadow of death. The only appropriate response to such a person is to take their hand and just cry with them for 20 minutes and leave it, well, sit with them as long as you can, but don't breathe a kind of so-called consoling word, because that just patronizes their pain, and it would be totally inappropriate. However, in another context, like we're trying to use our minds here to understand reality, on a different occasion, why the only way to make sense of suffering is to place it in a context which is so much vaster that it can show it to be what? Let's just say a little black daub on a magnificent painting where it serves a kind of purpose. If we place it in context, one other analogy. If a 2-year-old drops her ice cream cone, it's the end of the world. The mother knows it is not. The mother has a wider perspective. And I deeply believe that the great theological, metaphysical systems of the world's great religion have a context so vast that it can take the most agonizing suffering. Christ in Gethsemane, the night before the crucifixion, and place it in a context wherein it makes sense.
And what is the source of this belief? I mean, you acknowledge that this is not something you can prove to someone. You can't show them on a piece of paper the way you can verify scientific theories. What is it? And there are a lot of people who would like to agree with you,
yeah,
but can't bring themselves to do so. What is it? How are you so
I honor
sure?
those people, and I respect their integrity. And the worst mistake we can make is to pretend to believe something that really doesn't go all the way through our being. Sorry for the interruption.
Well, just did you? I mean, did you have a particular religious experience, or I know in your view it's possible to know something without being able to fully articulate it. In fact, this is to some extent the nature of religious knowledge, I guess. Is that? Have you had experiences that were, as they say, noetic, but ineffable? In other words, they filled you with great conviction, and you understand that other people haven't had them, but you have? Is that?
Yes. I would let Job speak for me. I had heard of you through the hearing of the ears, but now I see you. And by the way, there was a man who really suffered, and yet he came to a theophany wherein that suffering made sense. And I have had such experiences, but that's not the main reason for my belief. And if I put it whimsically, as one great theologian did when asked, how do you believe this? And he said, you're not going to like this, but my grandmother told me. Now, I won't put it quite that simplistically, but I have sought out and spent an average of about 5 to 8 years with the greatest minds and spirits that I could find and I've circled the globe to search for them. And getting to know them, and it was their blend of their powerful intellect that had irradiated into their life. And by the way, that doesn't mean like when they walked into a room where the lights go on and things like that. It could be very low key, and they were very unassuming, you might say, but watching them over the years in varieties of experience, I came to recognize these people know more than I do. And I came to believe what they said. But because of their modesty, they in turn say, well, we didn't figure this out, because between the finite and the infinite there is no commensurability. And there's no way the finite is going to comprehend the infinite on its own. That would be like trying to lift yourself with your own bootstrap. If there is going to be a wooing, it's kind of a love relation between the finite and the infinite, it has to be the infinite that takes the initiative, and that is the deepest meaning of revelation. So they in turn would say, I believe it not because my mentors would say, I believe it not because I figured it out, but because the Upanishad or the Sufi mystics or whatever received these revelations which give the gist of the most profound religious views of life.
Okay, but of course there are a lot of things in ancient scriptures that aren't true, and there are a lot of things that your grandmother tells you that aren't true, and there are a lot of things that smart people believe that aren't true. So was it something about the aura of these people that gave them credibility in your eyes, or?
No, they would agree. They all agreed with that. That one is never relieved of using one's intelligence, and one is never relieved of one's conscience, which tells you, yes, this clicks, this makes sense, I'm going to believe it, and then you come upon something like caste or slavery or gender relations, and you say, and what they tend to say is, it's beyond us to know what the circumstances were that generated these social things, but be that as it may, today they are anathema. And so there was nothing like submissive kowtowing to even the greatest strict scriptures, and I can add one thing. Of course, their views of the nature of the universe, physical universe, passé. They were, Copernican and all this kind of thing. Second is what we've been talking about, social relationship. And those new occasions teach new duties. Time makes ancient truth uncouth. Yes, they all agreed to that. They winnowed it. It was only on the biggest picture, the widest angle lens on the nature of things, that they felt in that area they have never been surpassed. And I agree.
And in addition, from reading your most recent book, I gather that in addition to discussions with people like this and moments of personal revelation, to some extent contemplating scientific findings themselves points you in the direction of religion. And one example is quantum physics, right? Would you talk about that a little, about quantum physics in particular?
I will. Science can say nothing directly about God, whether God exists or doesn't. But analogically, it's a gold mine. You asked about quantum mechanics. It has shown us that there are 3 great orders of magnitude, each of which has its own world and its own laws. In the very small, the micro world, this is quantum mechanics. Then there is the macro world that we're in right now, and then there is the mega world of the astronomers and sidereal space. Now, it is impossible to map either the micro world or the mega world onto our macro world, and our language was devised to deal with the macro world. So there's no way you can describe those worlds in ordinary, everyday language. You try, and you run into blatant contradictions at every point.
Like something is both a wave and a particle, for example.
Yeah, or the double slit experiment. Right. The beam goes through both slits simultaneously without dividing. Now, there's no way our rational minds can comprehend that. That gives us analogically the point that the infinite, which God is, cannot be stated in our everyday language literally, or you run into contradictions that are in all the scriptures. God is 3, but God is also 1. Christ is divine, but Christ is, and that's that. So the moral of that is the greatest mistake in really moving deeply into religion is not agnosticism or atheism. It's everydayism and thinking that we can state the basic truths about ultimate reality literally in our language. So literalism is the biggest barrier today of really understanding the profundities of religion.
The idea that anything real will be clearly describable.
That's right. And that's what takes us back to the mystery that they all insist on.
That all great religions insist on.
Right.
That all the religions insist on.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you a little about the relations among the world's religions right now at this point in history. There are certainly people who would say, and they would point to things like September 11th of last year or relations between India and Pakistan, and say that religion is doing at least as much harm as good in the world. Now, first of all, I assume, would you disagree with that? I assume you would, that you view religion as being on balance a positive force in the modern world, right?
Yes, I agree that it's profoundly ambiguous.
So it works both ways. Under the name of religion, very bad things are done. You would certainly agree.
Horrible.
Now, we're in a point in history where the world, economically is becoming more and more integrated. It's more and more like one world. And I'm wondering if you think that process can continue without more in the way of integration in some sense among the world's religions? Are there adjustments that the world's religions have to make, or accommodations to one another that they have to make in a period of globalization in order to keep from being destructive forces?
Well, it's easy to say what the adjustments would be, but whether they will be made or not is a very different question. What needs to be made, the adjustment, is now that we're rubbing shoulders with each other in multiculturalism, we very much need, in the area of faith, we need a policy of live and let live. Just as on the political scene, nations, yes, different nations, but let's try to move towards each can work out its own destiny. Now, so the solution in theory is easy. In practice, I am not optimistic. And the reason roots back deeper than religion into human nature. All the religions say that we are very flawed creatures. In Christianity, original sin. In Judaism, missing the mark. In Islam, ghafla, or a forgetful of our true nature. In the Indian religions, avidya, or ignorant. And in China, East Asia, the uncarved block, which is like the way we came into being, has been marred and gouged. So they all say there's something flawed within us. And they all agree, too, what that flaw is, to put ourselves above other people and our interests above other people. And when you get institutions, not only nations, but also churches, why they create in-group, out-group divisions. And it's in the character of human nature to be egocentric in terms of groups. Mm-hmm. And I think I can leave it at that in theory, yes, what we should do, whether we will achieve in doing it, I'm far from optimistic.
Are there some religions that historically have been better about tolerance of alternative beliefs than others?
Well, if I were forced to name one, I would say Buddhism probably has the best record, but I would not want to put a lot of emphasis in that. Certainly right now, in Sri Lanka, as one example, the Buddhist monks have become fierce little political enclaves. I wouldn't lay much stress on that, but if I had to prioritize one, I think Buddhism would surface.
Mm-hmm. The problem you've pointed to is the problem that, in a sense, religions are supposed to solve. I mean, wouldn't you say that one of the most fundamental things that religions are about is getting us to transcend our own narrow perspective?
Right.
So it's just kind of ironic if this is the very hurdle that religions themselves can't get over, right? I mean, that should be what they're specializing in, right?
Well, they all say this is the fundamental problem of human life. And if you put it in terms of the virtues would be charity, or at a more deep level, empathy. Rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who mourn. Mm-hmm. And recognize your neighbor as fully one, just like you yourself are. But we can't do that. Nobody can feel the hunger of a starving person as in the way that he or she would feel it if they were starving. And that just carries all the way across. So the best way to think of it is, this is the challenge of life. And though we can never achieve it completely within these mortal coils, the guideposts are very clear, and we can work incrementally towards increasing our empathy for other human beings.
Okay. Do you see any signs of that happening, of religions in a modern globalized world making accommodations to one another? Possibly doctrinal accommodations.
No, this is a very bleak time, because religions are being seized on by politicians, and politicians have no conscience about. They will seize anything that will help their political ambition, and so much of the mischief, or that's too light a word, tragedy and so on, that religion gets blamed for is actually the politicians should be blamed for it, because they use religion for their own end.
Mm-hmm. So in a sense, what the religions are missing is the fundamental, or a fundamental message of your first book, the World's Religions, which is your contention, at least, that they are all religions are saying at some fundamental level the same thing, right? That in theory they should feel a kinship with one another.
Right.
I
like the Irish tailor's adage of trousers, singular at the top, plural at the bottom, and that holds analogically for religion. In their deepest point, they converge.
Now, does this mean that you subscribe to what's sometimes called the perennial philosophy?
That name has spun off from Aldous Huxley's book By That, which stresses the mystical dimensions of religion, and there's a saying that mystics speak the same language, and it is true that if not identically, at least more the same message.
Okay. The word, and I saw this in a chart in your book, the word Godhead, the idea that, and this is very much a Hindu notion too, I guess, the idea that beyond, that all the specific gods that people believe in, at a more fundamental level, they are all the same, and they are all grounded in what is called the Godhead. Is that right? That's the notion?
Yes. We come back to the matter of mystery. All of these religions in their more profound aspects phase into mystery. And that ultimate mystery cannot be articulated and cannot be put into words. There's a technical word, two words, apophatic, cataphatic in Greek, what can be spoken, apophatic cannot be spoken, or the via negativa, via positiva, you can put into words via negativa, you phase beyond that. So the ultimate truth, wherein they all converge, is ineffable, and that, to make that distinction, Eckhart used the word God for God who is conceivable, sometimes called the personal God, because it is endowed with personal attributes, love, compassion, mercy, and power, and so on. But beyond that, there is the Godhead, or Tillich also spoke of the God of God, and then the God beyond God, which would be the equivalent of the Godhead. But let's recognize most people are very busy, and they don't have the time and luxury that I've had to study these, and one has to be very understanding that most of them are not able to lodge their ultimate belief in something that cannot be defined. Mm-hmm. So we must be tolerant about that.
Although a mystic would say, some mystics would say that although they can't articulate what the Godhead is, they have had some apprehension of it. In other words, to say you can't talk about it isn't to say you can't know it in some sense.
Oh, yeah.
Now, have you had the sense of knowing it or the sense of contact with it?
Oh, yes.
But you can't say anything about it, I guess.
No, I can. Well, there's a wonderful short poem on Everest, the West Ridge, and I wish I could quote it, but I can't. But I can give you the gist. The stone grows old. Eternity is not a stone. I mean, it doesn't grow old. Mm. And then it goes on to say that having reached this experience near the top of experience, I will go down and time will weave itself around me. But having known, now those two words are the crucial to the poem, or the heart. Having known, why time will no longer bind me in, and always I will feel it unraveling at the edges. For once I stood in the white, windy presence of eternity. So it's like that, having known, and we're back to Job, now my eyes see thee.
So you are enduringly liberated by one of these experiences.
Oh, yeah, of course it fades, you can't stay in it all the time, but you can always remember it.
And what do you have to say to people who aren't fortunate enough to have had one of these? I mean, I guess there are things you can do, and in fact, you meditate, don't you, every day? Although I've also read that you don't claim spectacular results on a daily basis or anything in your meditation at all.
Right.
But is that an example of a tool that someone can use to try to move in this direction?
Oh, yes. Meditation is coming in America, largely through Buddhism, but also Vedanta and other things. And there's been a tremendous rise in meditation. So that's one way to open one's sensibilities to the incursion of and directly experience the incursion of the more.
Okay. Have you also had experiences that were just unbidden? That you weren't seeking through meditation, but they just kind of hit you out of the blue?
Yeah.
And you can't, but they're hard to talk about, I guess. I mean, they're hard to.
No, I can talk. I can never do justice, but one can circle it and give some intimation. One moment that will never leave me is happened about 35 years ago, high up in the foothills of the Himalayas at 3 a.m. on a full moon night of October, when sitting with the Gutta Tibetan monks that I had gone to spend my sabbatical learning about the Tibetan tradition, and in this, the first morning of their 4-day puja, as it turned out, the full moon and so on, why, the first hour sitting with them was, they were chanting, and it was, the first hour was very monotonous, rhythmic, and so on, very deep, and then suddenly they splayed out into a tonic chord. And I thought, my word, they've got basses, baritones, tenors, and I had always understood harmony as a Western phenomenon, but here I was in Asia, and there it was. But that was nothing until after about 10 minutes, the choir cut out and left it all to a cantor. And that cantor was doing it all by himself. And what I mean doing it, meaning a first, third, and a fifth coming out of one barrel-chested larynx. That was a moment of epiphany.
And you helped make the West aware of that phenomenon, didn't you, as I recall?
Yes, I cannot say I was the first Westerner to hear that sound, but I certainly can say with confidence I was the first Westerner who heard it understandingly, because my mother was a music teacher and grounded us from infancy on in harmony, and also my hearing shot now, but it was very good to pick up and distinguish tone. So I was instantly aware I was in the presence of something the West knew nothing about, so I scrounged around, got a little tape recorder, took it back to MIT where I was teaching, and passed it by the leading scientist working on the acoustics of the human voice. He agreed that the West knew nothing about that, so I got a grant easily to go back and get a quality recording, which I brought out as a disc, and then Mickey Hart picks up the trail of the Grateful Dead, who himself is a fine ethnomusicologist on the side. So he put the infrastructure of the Dead behind a group of these monks, and they have now made 5 coast-to-coast sellout concerts, so it's becoming known.
But this was an epiphany of a religious sort for you.
Oh, that's an understatement. Understatement. It was the holiest sound I had ever heard. Now, granted that the surrounding contributed, those Himalayan mountains washed in the full moonlight and so on, was the context of this.
But for you, it was a moment of contact with something beyond. I mean, some people would say, yeah, that would experience and say it was very beautiful. It was a moment of great beauty, but they wouldn't feel that they had been in touch with something literally transcendent. But to you, that's what the moment meant.
Right. It also, my 20, 25 years of dunking my life in these profundities of these religions at their wisest, I'm sure, contributed to the sense of the holy.
But do you think some people are just kind of spiritually handicapped in a sense? In other words, their intuitive interpretation of something like that will be fundamentally just different from yours and less profound.
No, that's true. And there are, what shall I say, by nature atheists, and it serves them very well, and I respect them, do not fault them, but one of my claims to originality is that in studying the world's religions for 50 years, I've come to the conclusion that there is a spiritual counterpart to Carl Jung's psychological personality type. Jung thought there was the intuitive, I can't remember the fourth now, the
analytical,
sensing, the intuitive, the rational, and anyway.
Yeah.
But there's a counterpart to that, which is the atheist, there is no God. The polytheist, there are many gods, shaman, get in touch with them and so on. The monotheist, there is one God. And the mystic, there is only God, because God encompasses everything. And I'm inclined to think that just as Jung thought that we're born into one of these types, religiously, probably we are too, and we ought to respect those differences.
Well, what do you say to someone who would very much like to feel the way you do about the universe, but isn't so inclined to do it? You know, someone who's really seeking spiritual depth. Is there something they can do to get closer? Something in the way of daily practice or...
Of course. Go to work. And the first thing and most instructive, probably easiest, is to read accounts. And they are graded in terms of profundity, but I would start with the Bhagavad Gita or the Sermon on the Mount or the Upanishad, and then if that piques their interest, and I'm just accounting my route, I would then search out the most profound and wisest person that I knew whose life was religiously centered, and go to school to them.
Okay. I'd like to ask you a little bit, press you a little further on your conception of God. I mean, we've talked a little about the Godhead, which is something even more profound than God in your view, and which by definition you can't really talk about clearly.
Well, one can circle the question,
right,
and aim at it, but realizing one will, with the finite mind, one will never get fully there.
Okay, but God, in your view, as distinguished from the Godhead, God is something that you can talk about a little more precisely? Is that?
Yeah.
Right, and I'm curious about your conception of God because of your background.
Right.
You were you told me you attend a Methodist church, and in fact your parents were Methodist missionaries. But there's something also very Eastern about your perspective, and I guess one reason is because they were missionaries in China, and that's where you grew up. And in all your writing, it seems to me you give a lot of weight to an Eastern way of describing spiritual experience or ultimate reality.
Let me, if I may, change that slightly. It's true that I came upon these profound truths through Asia, through the Vedanta and Buddhism and the like, and the Sufis. But I came to realize that they are all present in Christianity. It is just that they were never told me. Nobody ever pointed me to those same profundities in Christianity.
So then, for example, you would say that maybe Brahman, what the Hindus call the ultimate reality, is comparable to what Eichert may have called the Godhead. Is that an example? Okay.
Yeah.
Or Eckhart, Meister Eckhart. Does it? But I guess that's kind of my question. How, given how broadly grounded you are, how specifically can you have a conception of God in your mind when you go to your Methodist church? Are you thinking about it the way the other people in your Methodist church are thinking about it?
Probably, yes and no. Up to a point, yes. But, and I don't make any great claim, I've just had the great fortune to spend my working years plumbing these traditions. These people are very busy, and they don't have that time. But I feel bonded with them because in the area of God, as over against the Godhead, why, I share their views. And when I go to church, well, let me precede this by saying, you cannot speak language. You can speak French, German, Japanese, Portuguese, and so on. You have to speak a language. And therefore, it would be a delusion to think that I could zap straight for the Godhead. No. And on that level of God, why, I'm deeply bonded with them and my heritage and my present. And on Sunday mornings in church, I don't want to hear about the other religions. I know it's become kind of fashionable for mainline churches to give sermons on Buddhism and so on, and I don't like it because every tradition needs its boundaries, otherwise it just splays out into a few moral aphorisms. And we need the definition, at least I need the definition, to form the basis from which I can go like a springboard up into the higher dimensions of truth.
Well, at the same time, you do believe that even as you worship a God in church, that a non-theistic Buddhist, although there are plenty of theistic Buddhists, but a non-theistic Buddhist has a religious experience that's, in a sense, every bit as valid as yours.
Oh, absolutely. And that's a little tricky in terms of language, theistic and non-theistic. It depends on what you mean by God. Mm-hmm. And personal God, yes. Theravada Buddhism is atheistic. But in terms of the transpersonal Godhead, it has it just as strongly.
And is nirvana a form of that?
Yeah.
Okay. And finally, I just wanted to ask you a little about death. That for a lot of people, this is a lot of what religion brings to them, is consolation about the inevitability of death. But in different religions, people have a very different conception of what death is like. Christians might think of pretty much themselves being transported to another land that's better than this one. Whereas Buddhists, some Buddhists at least, might have a very different conception of what it is that you're aspiring to in the afterlife. Again, it gets back to the fact that your perspective is so broad and, in a way, inclusive. How do you think of it, and is it of comfort to you?
I think of it as I do most of the important areas of religion, as a case of theme and variation. The variations are great. Just an obvious one. India believes in reincarnation. We come back in a different form or a different body in this world. And Christianity, it's not too well known that for the first 3 centuries, Christians believed in reincarnation too, but then it was pronounced a heresy. In any case, the variations differ, but now, what about the theme that runs through them all? First of all, they all say, as Saul Bellow, the novelist, put it once, nobody believes that the pictures stop. And that's the first thing. The second thing is that, now here there's one variation, but I'll say for the rest they all say, we do not complete our life's work when we shed the body, as India puts it. There is more to be done, and this more is in the form of cleansing. And then again, the metaphors differ, purgatory, hell, and so on. And the reason they all say there must be cleansing is all of us do things in our life that we, some of them we admit, others we rationalize away. But heaven, which is only a metaphor for our spiritual destiny, is completely pure, and we cannot take our dross into that realm. So the dross has to be gotten rid of, and the dominant metaphor there is flames, as in hell, but there's a great difference in sophistication of seeing that literally or metaphorically. And those who realize that the truths of the infinite cannot be stated consistently in ordinary language say that the deep truth that they are metaphors, these physical flames are metaphors for, is that when we die, we will see our lives with complete objectivity, which we cannot now. And like drowning people, one hears that the whole life passes before them in a few seconds. It will be like that. But this time, we will see how our actions affected other people very clearly, and it will not be a pleasant sight. It will in part, but all the misdemeanors and selfishness, self-centeredness, the pain we cause even those we love will be starkly before us. There will be no place to hide, and that vision will be, the Greeks had the myth of the shirt of Nissus that was made of fire, and for a period it will, our conscience, it will be like a shirt of Nissus as we are brought face to face at how faithless we were towards other people, self-seeking, putting ourselves first, and things like that. But it's temporary. And all except the literalists who stop at a kind of third grade level, the Buddhists put it in terms of bardos and other states. And when the impurities have been fully faced and recognized, then that shirt of Nissus falls from our back, and our spirits will be pure and capable of entering heaven, nirvana, whatever you want to call the eternity of spirit.
So you, on the one hand, don't have a real detailed conception of the afterlife the way some people might, but you definitely envision a period, first of all, of kind of unpleasant atonement or acknowledgement of the inevitable shortcomings of life. But that is ultimately followed by something which, again, I guess you can't conceptualize very clearly, but it's preferable to that first phase, it sounds like.
Well, the Buddha was very diligent in recognizing that nirvana could not be described in everyday language, and all of his descriptions are, it's not this, neti, but he used one positive word. He said nirvana is bliss. In other words, the full meaning and glory of all existence will be made evident to us.
Well, that's a positive note to end on, and a reassuring one. Thanks very much. Do you have something else to say?
Well, I'm a little disturbed by, earlier you said, is it a comfort to you? And then now you say reassurance. Well, yes it is, but that patronizes the basic religious stand, which is not, though the charge is made over and over, wishful thinking. The real reason is truth.
The real reason
for believing that is that you recognize that it's true. India says it in an aphorism, there is no right that is superior to that of truth. Mm-hmm. And I would insist on that. Yes, it is a heartening view of life, but we have the saying, it's too good to be true. Well, what meanness of spirit causes us to put it that way rather than saying, oh, that scenario is too bad to be true.
Yeah. And it also seems to me that, as in some ways reassuring as some religious doctrines may be, a truly, in some sense, a deep spiritual life, a reflective spiritual life, can be very uncomfortable in somewhat the way you suggest. Because the object of the game, one part of it, is to be aware of your own egotism.
Absolutely.
And including in its subtle forms that you're usually not aware of unless you really pause to think about it.
Right, right.
So part of the goal of the religious life should be to become uncomfortable with yourself in some sense.
That's true. And when I was a graduate student at the University of Chicago, as the class was just beginning to get underway, why, you know how brash 20 years olds are. And one of the students, before the class began, asked the professor, why are you a Christian? And without batting an eye, he said, because I believe in the forgiveness of sin. And that is what you're saying, recognition of the flaw within us.
And recognition of sin being a prerequisite for the forgiveness.
Well, that can go down many roads, but I guess forgiveness implies a forgiver, and whether you think of it as the more honest part within you, the deeper part, or externally, those are simply spatial metaphors. They come to the same thing.
So then a completely kind of non-theistic person could be deeply religious, in your view, if they draw on that part of themselves. If they demand of themselves, first of all, honest recognition of their shortcomings, and then having recognized them, forgive themselves.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's encouraging. Okay. Well, again, thanks a lot for taking the time.
Pleasure. Thank you.